Maya Chen had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. It was a trait that had served her well during her 15-year career as a senior data analyst at Nexcore Industries, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the Pacific Northwest. She saw patterns in spreadsheets that told stories her colleagues couldn't read. She found discrepancies in reports that others deemed insignificant. She connected dots that weren't supposed to be connected. And 6 months ago, she had stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It started with a routine audit of clinical trial data for Synaptal, Nexcore's revolutionary new antidepressant that promised to cure treatment-resistant depression without the debilitating side effects of existing medications. The drug was 3 months away from FDA approval. The company's stock price had already doubled in anticipation of what analysts were calling the pharmaceutical breakthrough of the decade. Maya had been reviewing patient outcome reports from the Phase 3 trials when she noticed something odd. The data was too clean, too perfect. In her experience, clinical trials always had messy data. There were always outliers, anomalies, patients who didn't respond as expected, or who experienced unusual side effects. But the Synaptal data looked like it had been generated by a computer program designed to produce ideal results. Showed improvement. Every side effect was mild and transient. Every metric exceeded the predetermined success criteria by a comfortable but not suspicious margin. It was, in a word, impossible. She had spent the next 3 weeks digging deeper, working late into the night after her colleagues had gone home, accessing databases she technically had clearance for but rarely used. What she found made her stomach turn. The trial data hadn't just been cleaned up, it had been completely fabricated. Patients listed in the reports didn't exist. The hospitals where the trials supposedly took place had never heard of the study. The doctors who signed off on the results were either retired, deceased, or worked in completely different fields. But the real horror came when she found the shadow data. Buried in an encrypted server she accessed using credentials she had borrowed from a drunk IT manager at the company Christmas party. This data showed the real trials, the ones that had been conducted in secret at a private facility in rural Oregon. And the results were devastating. Synaptal didn't cure depression. It caused it, along with violent psychotic episodes, permanent neurological damage, and a mortality rate of nearly 30%. 63 people had died during the real trials. 63 people whose families had been paid millions to sign non-disclosure agreements and falsified death certificates. Maya had sat in her dark office staring at her computer screen, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her coffee mug. She was looking at evidence of mass murder, of corporate conspiracy on a scale she could barely comprehend. And she knew that the moment Synaptal hit the market, thousands perhaps, millions of people would be prescribed this drug. They would take it trusting that it was safe, that it had been properly tested, that the FDA approval meant something. And they would die, or worse, they would become the kind of people who hurt others before dying themselves. She had tried to do the right thing. She really had. She had compiled her evidence into a detailed report and submitted it to her supervisor, then to her supervisor's supervisor, then to the head of the ethics committee. Each time she was told the same thing with slight variations. The data must be corrupted. She must have made an error in her analysis. She was overworked and needed a vacation. She should focus on her assigned projects and leave the complex clinical analysis to the specialists. When she persisted, the responses became less friendly. She was called into meetings with human resources. Her performance reviews, which had always been exemplary, suddenly became critical. Her access to certain databases was quietly revoked. Her office was moved to a different floor, away from her team. The message was clear: drop it or face the consequences. But Maya couldn't drop it. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror, knowing what she knew and doing nothing. So she had gone external. She contacted the FDA anonymously, only to discover that 3 senior officials at the agency had financial ties to Nexca. She reached out to journalists at major newspapers, but her story was too big, too unbelievable without the kind of corroboration that would take months to develop. And she didn't have months. She tried to contact the families of the victims from the real trials, But the non-disclosure agreements they had signed were ironclad, and most of them were too afraid or too ashamed to talk. One woman, the mother of a 23-year-old who had jumped off a bridge 3 days into the trial, had listened to Maya's story and then quietly said, "They own everything. The judges, the lawyers, the police. You can't fight them. I tried. I lost everything. Just save yourself." But saving herself would mean letting Synaptil go to market. It would mean being complicit in what would happen next. And Maya had realized, somewhere during those long, terrified nights, that there was only one way to stop this. She needed to force NextScore to acknowledge what they had done. She needed to create a situation so public, so dramatic, that they couldn't cover it up or make it disappear. She needed witnesses who couldn't be silenced, evidence that couldn't be destroyed, and a platform that couldn't be ignored. She needed the quarterly board meeting where every major stakeholder, every C-suite executive, and every board member would be gathered in one room, where the media would already be present to cover the anticipated announcement of the FDA approval date, where security would be focused on external threats, not internal ones, where she could finally make them listen. The morning of the board meeting, Maya woke up at 4 a.m., though she hadn't really slept. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, mentally rehearsing what she was about to do, checking and rechecking her plan for flaws. She showered, dressed in her most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that made her look serious and competent, and made herself breakfast that she couldn't eat. Her stomach was a twisted knot of anxiety and determination. On her kitchen table lay a black canvas messenger bag, containing everything she needed for what she had started calling the revelation in her mind. Inside were multiple USB drives, each containing complete copies of all the evidence she had gathered, the real trial data, the falsified reports, the financial records showing the payoffs to victims' families, email chains discussing the cover-up, and recordings of phone calls she had secretly made with various NextScore executives who had inadvertently confirmed pieces of the conspiracy while trying to intimidate her into silence. Also in the bag was a handgun, a Glock 19 she had purchased legally 3 weeks ago after taking a firearms safety course and obtaining her concealed carry permit. She had never imagined herself as someone who would own a gun, let alone use one, but she needed something that would immediately command attention, something that would freeze everyone in place long enough for her to speak. She had no intention of shooting anyone. The gun would be aimed at the presentation screen, at the inanimate corporate logo that symbolized everything rotten about NextScore. But she knew that simply revealing the evidence wouldn't be enough. Corporate scandals got buried all the time. What she needed was a moment so shocking, so undeniable, that it would become national news within minutes. She needed the kind of an incident that would force law enforcement to investigate, that would make the cover-up impossible. And she had realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that firing a gun in a room full of powerful people would accomplish exactly that. The drive to NextScore's downtown headquarters took 25 minutes through light morning traffic. Maya parked in her assigned spot in the underground garage and sat in her car for a few minutes, gathering her courage. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was adrenaline, anticipation, and something else. Something that felt almost like relief. After 6 months of secrets and nightmares, she was finally going to act. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, older than her 38 years, but her eyes were clear and determined. She picked up her phone and sent a single email to a distribution list she had carefully compiled over the past weeks. Addresses for investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, members of Congress who sat on healthcare oversight committees, and advocacy groups for pharmaceutical safety. The email contained links to cloud storage accounts where she had uploaded all her evidence with detailed explanations and a timeline of the conspiracy. The email was scheduled to send automatically in 2 hours. At exactly 10 a.m., which was when the board meeting would be reaching its climax, the NextScore building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel. 48 stories of modern corporate architecture that dominated the Seattle skyline. Maya rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, where the executive offices and main conference room were located. The elevator was crowded with other employees, people she had worked alongside. For years, people who smiled and made small talk and had no idea what was about to happen. She smiled back, participated in a brief conversation about weekend plans, and felt like she was watching herself from a great distance. The conference room was already filling up when she arrived at 8:30. The meeting wasn't scheduled to start until 9, but people always arrived early for the quarterly board meetings. There was coffee and pastries set up on a side table, and clusters of executives stood around talking in low voices, their body language confident and relaxed. This was their domain, their moment of triumph. The FDA approval was essentially guaranteed, and everyone in this room stood to make millions, some of them tens of millions. When Synapto launched, Maya helped herself to coffee she didn't want and found a seat near the back of the room. As a senior analyst, she was expected to attend these meetings but rarely participated actively. She was part of the scenery, someone who provided data when asked, but otherwise remained invisible. It was perfect. Nobody paid any attention to her as she settled into her chair and placed her messenger bag on the floor beside her. With an easy reach, she watched as the room continued to fill. There was Marcus Thornton, the CEO, a silver-haired man in his late 50s who had built NextScore from a small biotech startup into a pharmaceutical giant. He was laughing at something, his hand on the shoulder of Eleanor Vance, the chief medical officer, who Maya now knew, had personally overseen the falsification of the trial data. There was David Chen, no relation to Maya, despite sharing a last name, the chief financial officer who had structured the payments to the victims' families through a web of shell companies. There was Patricia Morgan, the head of regulatory affairs, who had coached the FDA officials on exactly what language to use in their approval documentation to avoid triggering any red flags. They were all here. All the architects of the conspiracy gathered in one room, completely unaware that their world was about to end. Maya felt a strange calm descend over her. She had been terrified for so long, terrified of what she knew, terrified of what might happen to her, terrified of the responsibility she carried. But now, in this moment, the fear had been replaced by something colder and more powerful: certainty. She was absolutely certain that what she was about to do was necessary. Not right, perhaps, but necessary. She thought about the 63 people who had died in the real trials, young people mostly, desperate people who had volunteered for what they thought was a chance at a better life. She thought about the thousands who would die if she did nothing. And she thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago. A woman who believed that systems worked, that rules mattered, that good people in positions of power would do the right thing when confronted with the truth. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a machine was to break it, so completely that it couldn't be repaired. The meeting started precisely at 9 o'clock. Marcus Thornton called the room to order and launched into his opening remarks. A triumphant speech about NextScore's achievements over the past quarter and the bright future that awaited them. Maya barely heard the words. She was focused on her breathing, on staying calm, on waiting for the right moment. The presentation moved through financial results, pipeline updates, and marketing strategies. 40 minutes passed, then 50. And then Eleanor Vance stood up to give the update everyone had been waiting for, the latest on Synapto's path to FDA approval. She clicked through slides showing the excellent safety profile, the remarkable efficacy data, the overwhelmingly positive feedback from the advisory committee. Maya felt her jaw clench. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, so utterly convincing. If she hadn't seen the real data, she would have believed every word. This was the moment. Eleanor was building toward her conclusion, toward the announcement that the official approval was expected within days. In her peripheral vision, Maya could see people leaning forward, smiling, already calculating their bonuses. She reached down slowly, carefully, and unzipped her messenger bag. Maya's hand closed around the grip of the Glock, and she felt its weight, solid and real and irreversible. She stood up smoothly, her chair rolling back with a soft whisper against the carpet. For a moment, nobody noticed. Vance was still, talking, her laser pointer dancing across the projection screen, highlighting mortality rates that were complete fiction. But then the woman sitting next to Maya glanced over, and her eyes went wide, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. The reaction rippled outward like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone gasped. And then everyone in. The room was staring at Maya, at the gun in her hand, at the expression on her face that must have looked absolutely insane. She raised the weapon, arm fully extended, and aimed it directly at the presentation screen, at the glowing NextCore logo, and the falsified data beneath it. Time seemed to slow down, became thick and viscous like moving through honey. She could see every detail with crystalline clarity. Marcus Thornton, half freezing from his seat, his face draining of color. Eleanor Vance, frozen with her fingers still. On the presentation remote, David Chen backing away toward the windows, his hands raised defensively. Patricia Morgan reaching for her phone. "Don't move," Maya said, and her voice came out surprisingly steady, surprisingly loud in the sudden silence. "Don't touch your phones. Don't try to leave. You're all going to listen to what I have to say, and then you're going to understand why I'm doing this." She could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. Could they rush her? Could they talk her down? Could they get to the door before she fired? But the gun held them all in place. A small piece of metal that somehow contained more power than all of their money and influence combined. "My name is Maya Chen," she continued, even though most of them knew exactly who she was. "For the past 6 months, I've been investigating Synaptal. The real Synaptal trials, not the fairy tale Eleanor just presented. I found the truth. I found all of it." She saw recognition dawn on some faces. Saw Eleanor Vance's expression shift from fear to something harder and more calculating. Marcus Thornton's jaw tightened. They knew she knew. They had probably been waiting for this in some form, ever since she had started asking questions. 63 people died during the real trials, Maya said, and her voice cracked slightly. On the number, 63 people who trusted you, who trusted the system, who believed they were part of something that would help others. They died horribly. They became violent, psychotic. They hurt themselves and others, and you covered it up. You paid off their families. You falsified every piece of documentation, created fake patients, fake hospitals, fake results. Now you're about to unleash this poison on millions of people. She could see some of the board members looking confused. These were the outside directors, the investors, the people who weren't part of the day-to-day operations. They were learning about this for the first time. Their faces showed genuine shock. Good. She needed witnesses who didn't have skin in the game, who couldn't be accused of bias. "I have copies of everything," Maya continued. The real trial. Data. The payment records. The emails. The recordings. It's all on USB drives in my bag, and it's also uploaded to multiple cloud servers. In exactly, she glanced at her watch, 48 minutes. Links to all of that evidence will be emailed to federal prosecutors, journalists, and congressional oversight committees. Marcus Thornton finally found his voice. "Maya, please, put the gun down. Let's talk about this. If you have concerns about the trial data, there are proper channels. I tried the proper channels." The words exploded out of her, months of frustration and fear condensing into a shout that echoed off the glass walls. "I tried everything proper. I reported it to my supervisor, to ethics, to compliance. I contacted the FDA. Do you know what happened? Nothing. Less than nothing. I was demoted, harassed, threatened. You own the proper channels, Marcus. You own all of it." She took a breath, steadied herself. This wasn't about her anger. This was about creating an event that couldn't be ignored. So I'm creating a new channel, this one. And then before anyone could react, before she could second-guess herself, before fear could override determination, Maya squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, a crack of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bullet struck the presentation screen dead center, right through the NextCore logo, and the screen exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. For 3 seconds, absolute silence. The frozen moment of shock that Maya had been counting on. The instant where everyone's brain simply stopped processing because What had just happened was too far outside the bounds of normal experience. And then chaos. Screaming, shouting, chairs toppling over as people scrambled for the exits. But Maya raised the gun again, fired a second shot into the ceiling, and everyone froze once more. I said, "Don't move." Her voice cut through the panic. "Like a whip, I didn't shoot at any of you. I won't unless you force me to. But you need to stay here. You need to hear this. Because in about 2 minutes, the police are going to arrive, and when they do, this becomes a national news story. A senior analyst at a major pharmaceutical company fires a gun during a board meeting. That's the kind of thing that leads to investigations. Real investigations by people you don't control." She could see understanding dawning on Marcus Thornton's face, a terrible realization. She had trapped them. The moment she fired that gun, she had guaranteed that law enforcement would get involved, that there would be questions that couldn't be brushed aside, that the evidence she had compiled would become part of an official investigation. Even if they killed her right now, even if they somehow managed to suppress the emails, the story was already out. Woman shot in corporate board meeting. Police would search the conference room. They would find her bag with the USB drives. They would have to follow up. Eleanor Vance must have reached the same conclusion because she said, its voice tight with controlled fury, "You've destroyed yourself for nothing. Even if your accusations are true, which they're not, you'll go to prison. 20 years minimum for assault with a deadly weapon." Was it worth it? Maya felt a smile cross her face, cold and humorless. "I don't expect to walk out of this room a free woman, Eleanor. I knew that before I walked in, but yes, it was worth it, because Synaptal will never make it to market now. The FDA will have to halt the approval process pending investigation. Your stock price will collapse. Investors will demand answers. And even if you somehow manage to avoid criminal charges, even if your army of lawyers ties this up in court for years, that drug will never touch a single patient. I'll trade my freedom for that every single time." The sirens had started then, distant but growing rapidly louder. Multiple vehicles converging on the building from different directions. Someone must have hit a silent alarm, or maybe the gunshots had triggered acoustic sensors. Or perhaps someone in a nearby building had called 911. The how didn't matter. What mattered was that they were coming, and everything was about to change. The police arrived in force, dozens of officers flooding into the building, evacuating floors, establishing a perimeter. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Maya could see news helicopters circling, their cameras undoubtedly broadcasting live. Footage, she could see crowds gathering on the street below, phones held up, recording. This was exactly what she had needed. Witnesses, documentation, an event too public to disappear. The standoff lasted another hour. Police negotiators tried to establish communication, but Maya refused to engage until she had made her full statement, until she had detailed every piece of evidence she possessed and where it could be found. She made them put a phone on speaker, so the entire room could hear. She wanted everyone present to know exactly what she was accusing NextCore of. She wanted their reactions on record, on video, on audio recordings that would become part of the official investigation. Marcus Thornton's face cycled through emotions: fear, anger, calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned defeat. He knew it was over. Even if he personally escaped prosecution, even if the company survived, his reputation was destroyed. His legacy would forever be tied to this moment, to the woman with the gun who exposed his crimes. When Maya finally surrendered, lowering the weapon and placing it carefully on the table before raising her hands above her head, she felt an odd sense of peace. The police rushed in, tackled her to the ground with more force than was strictly necessary, cuffed her hands behind her back. Someone was reading her rights, but she barely heard the words. She had done it. She had actually done it. As they dragged her out of the conference room, past shocked executives and traumatized board members, she saw Eleanor Vance staring at her with an expression of pure hatred. "You'll rot in prison for this," Eleanor hissed, "and it won't change anything. You're delusional if you think this matters." But Maya saw the fear behind the anger, and she smiled. "We'll see," she said simply. The media circus that followed was even more intense than Maya had anticipated. By that afternoon, her face was on every major news network. Pharmaceutical whistleblower fires gun at board meeting read the headlines. The story had everything. Corporate conspiracy, deadly drugs, a desperate woman taking extreme action. It was irresistible, and then the evidence she had compiled began to leak. The emails she had sent reached their destinations and were immediately forwarded to news organizations. Journalists who had been too cautious to run with her story before suddenly found themselves with documentation that was impossible to ignore. The real trial data, the payments to victims' families, the falsified FDA submissions, all of it started appearing in investigative reports. Federal prosecutors opened an investigation within 48 hours. The FDA announced a formal review of Synaptal's approval process. Nexus stock price went into freefall, dropping 40% in 2 days. Several board members resigned. Marcus Thornton was placed on administrative leave. Eleanor Vance's medical license was suspended pending investigation. And Maya sat in a jail cell, denied bail because of the severity of the charges against her, and watched it all unfold on a small television in the common area. She had been right. The evidence alone wouldn't have been enough. People ignored whistleblowers every day. Documents got buried. Investigations got sidelined. But a woman firing a gun in a boardroom? It was impossible to ignore? Her public defender, a tired-looking woman in her 30s named Jennifer Park, had looked at the evidence against Maya and then at Maya herself with a mixture of admiration and despair. You do realize you committed multiple felonies on camera in front of dozens of witnesses, right? Even if everything you're saying about NextScore is true, even if they all go to prison, you're still looking at serious time. No, Maya had said quietly. I knew before I did it, but how many people would have died if I hadn't?
Oh.
Jennifer had no answer to that. As the weeks passed and the investigation into NextScore expanded, Maya's story began to shift in the public consciousness. At first, she was simply the woman who fired a gun. But as more evidence emerged, as the scale of NextScore's fraud became undeniable, she started being called the whistleblower who had no choice. Op-eds appeared, arguing about whether her actions were justified. Legal scholars debated the concept of necessity as a defense for what she had done. Advocacy groups rallied around her case. But Maya wasn't particularly interested in becoming a symbol or a martyr. She had done what she felt she had to do, and she would accept the consequences, what sustained her during those long days. In jail was the knowledge that Synaptal would never reach the market. The FDA had officially withdrawn its approval. NextScore executives had been indicted on fraud charges. The families of the 63 victims from the real trials were coming forward, their non-disclosure agreements rendered void by the criminal investigation. Justice was slow and imperfect, but it was happening. And it was happening because she had created a moment so dramatic, so undeniable, that the entire system had been forced to respond. Trial began 6 months after the shooting. Prosecution's case was straightforward. Maya Chen had brought a loaded firearm into a corporate office and discharged it in a room full of people. The charges included assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and several weapons violations. The evidence was overwhelming, captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of people. An open and shut case. But Maya's defense team, which had grown considerably as pro bono lawyers joined the case, argued something different. They argued necessity. They argued whistleblower protection taken to its logical extreme. They argued that Maya had exhausted all legal remedies and had acted to prevent imminent harm to thousands of people. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the real Synaptal trial data, about how many people would have died if the drug had been released. They presented evidence of Maya's attempts to report through proper channels and how she had been systematically thwarted. Painted a picture of a woman driven to desperate action by a corrupt system that left her no other choice. The prosecution countered that regardless of her motivations, Maya had broken the law in a dangerous and reckless manner. That she could have killed someone, the vigilante justice was not justice at all. Both sides had valid points, and the jury deliberated for 5 days before reaching a verdict. Maya stood as the foreman read it out, her heart pounding, but her face calm. She had made peace with whatever was coming, guilty on all counts. But then something unexpected happened. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Reeves, who had been on the bench for 30 years, announced that she was departing from the sentencing guidelines. She looked directly at Maya as she spoke, and her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sympathetic. "Ms. Chen, you committed serious crimes. You brought a weapon into a workplace and discharged it, creating a situation that could easily have resulted in deaths or serious injuries. The law is clear on this, and a message must be sent that such actions cannot be tolerated." Judge Reeves paused, and in that silence Maya could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every choice she had made pressing down on her shoulders. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, NextCorp employees, and families. Of the victims from the real synaptal trials? Outside, protesters held vigils on both sides of the issue, some calling for her imprisonment, others demanding her freedom. The case had become a cultural flashpoint, a Rorschach test for how people viewed corporate accountability, whistleblower protection, and the limits of justified civil disobedience. However, Judge Reeves continued, and Maya saw something shift. In her expression, "The court must also consider the context and consequences of your actions. You discovered evidence of corporate fraud that would have resulted in potentially thousands of deaths. You attempted to report this information through every available legal channel and were systematically silenced. Your actions, while illegal, directly prevented a dangerous drug from reaching the market and exposed criminal conduct that would otherwise have remained hidden." The judge glanced down at her notes, then back at Maya. "The court has reviewed dozens of letters on your behalf, including from medical ethicists, pharmaceutical safety advocates, and families of the individuals who died during the real synaptal trials. These letters paint a picture of someone who acted not out of malice or mental instability, but out of a deep moral conviction that transcended concern for her own welfare." Maya felt Jennifer Park's hand squeeze her shoulder gently, a gesture of support that somehow made her want to cry for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "Therefore," Judge Reeves said, "while I am sentencing you to 5 years in prison, I am suspending all but 18 months of that sentence. With good behavior, you will likely serve approximately 1 year. Additionally, I am strongly recommending that the governor's office consider this case for executive clemency." The courtroom erupted, shouting, cheering, angry protests, the bang of the judge's gavel trying to restore order. Maya just stood there trying to process what had happened. 1 year, she had expected 10, possibly 15. 1 year she could survive. 1 year was nothing compared to what could have happened if Synaptal had been released as the bailiffs led her away. She turned back to look at the courtroom one last time. In the gallery, she saw Sarah Morrison, the mother who had lost her son in the real trials, the woman who had warned Maya that fighting NextCorp was hopeless. Sarah was crying, but she was also smiling, and she pressed her hand to her heart a gesture that needed no translation. "Thank you." Yeah. Maya nodded back, and then she was moving through the corridor toward the holding cell, her mind already adjusting to this new reality. 1 year? She could do 1 year. The months that followed. Her sentencing brought changes that Maya could never have anticipated. The investigation into NextCorp expanded to include other pharmaceutical companies, other potentially falsified trials. Congress held hearings on the FDA approval process and implemented new oversight requirements. Protection laws directly inspired by Maya's case, laws that provided legal immunity for employees who exposed imminent public health threats. Even if their methods fell outside traditional channels, NextCorp itself never recovered. The company declared bankruptcy within a year. Its assets liquidated to pay settlements to the victims' families. Marcus Thornton, Eleanor Vance, and 5 other executives were convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and manslaughter. Their sentences ranged from 12 to 25 years. The corporate fraud case became a landmark prosecution, one of the few times in modern history where pharmaceutical executives actually went to prison for their crimes. Maya served her year at the Washington Corrections Center for Women, a low-security facility about 30 miles south of Seattle. It was nothing like the dramatic prison scenes from movies. Mostly, it was boring, monotonous, a a strange liminal space where time moved differently than in the outside world. Worked in the library, helped other inmates with legal correspondence, and tried not to think too much about what her life would look like when she got out. But even in prison, her story continued to resonate. She received hundreds of letters every week from people around the world. Some were from other whistleblowers who had tried to expose corporate wrongdoing and been crushed by the system. Some were from families who had lost loved ones to dangerous medications that had been improperly tested or fraudulently marketed. Some were from people who simply wanted to tell her that they thought she was brave, that they admired what she had done. One letter stood out among the rest. It came from Dr. Rachel Kim, the head of a new pharmaceutical safety organization that had been founded in the wake of the Nextcore scandal. Dr. Kim wrote that her organization was dedicated to independent verification of clinical trial data, providing a check on pharmaceutical companies' self-reporting, and she wanted Maya to join them when she was released, to use her analytical skills and her intimate knowledge of how corporate fraud operated to help prevent another synaptol from ever getting close to FDA approval. "You've already sacrificed so much," Dr. Kim wrote. "But if you're willing, you could help us build something that ensures your sacrifice meant more than just stopping one bad drug. You could help us change the system." Maya read that letter a dozen times, sitting on her bunk in the small cell she shared with a woman named Lisa, who was serving time for embezzlement. A chance to do meaningful work, to continue fighting the fight that had cost her so much. A chance to turn her notorious past into a constructive future. "Yes," she thought. "Yes, I'll do that." She was released on a clear October morning, 18 months after firing those shots that changed everything. The prison gates opened and Maya walked out into autumn sunshine, blinking at the brightness after months of artificial lighting. A small crowd was waiting for her. Jennifer Park was there, along with several of the lawyers who had worked on her case. Dr. Kim was there, smiling and holding a folder that Maya assumed contained employment paperwork. Sarah Morrison was there, and several other family members of victims from the real trials. There were reporters, of course, dozens of them, cameras and microphones, and shouted questions. Maya had prepared a statement, something brief and measured, but as she stood there looking at all these people, at the lives that had intersected with hers through tragedy and justice and consequence, different words came out. "I'm not a hero," she said, and her voice was scratchy from disuse, but steady. "Heroes don't break the law. Heroes don't force people to experience trauma because of their choices. What I did was illegal and dangerous, and I'm lucky nobody was. Hurt," she paused, organizing her thoughts.
Nice.
"But I'd do it again. Because sometimes the systems we're supposed to trust don't work. Sometimes the people in power put profit over human life. And when that happens, someone has to stand up, even if standing up means falling down yourself," the reporter shouted. Follow-up questions, but Maya just shook her head and walked toward the car where Dr. Kim was waiting. As they drove away from the prison, away from that chapter of her life, Maya looked out the window at the world that had continued turning. While she was locked away, so much had changed, and yet so much remained the same. There were still corrupt companies, still dangerous products, still people who needed someone to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. Her phone, which she hadn't been allowed to have in prison, buzzed constantly with notifications, messages, interview requests. She ignored them all and instead opened her email to the address Dr. Kim had given her. The subject line read, "Welcome to the team." Inside was information about her new position, Senior Analyst for Clinical Trial Verification. She would review pharmaceutical trial data submitted to the FDA, looking for the same red flags she had found in Synaptol's documentation. She would have the authority to trigger independent audits, would have protection under the new whistleblower laws. She would have the power to stop another tragedy before it started. It wasn't redemption exactly. Maya wasn't sure she believed in redemption, at least not the neat kind where everything worked out and everyone learned their lessons. People were still angry at her. Some thought her sentence was too harsh, others thought it was too lenient. Nextcore's remaining employees, innocent people who had lost their jobs when the company collapsed, certainly had reason to resent her. The victims' families had their loved ones back, but carried trauma that would never fully heal. But maybe it was enough to have tried, to have stood in that conference room and refused to let evil pass unchallenged. Maybe it was enough to have fired those shots that started the sirens wailing, that brought light into darkness, that proved that sometimes one person actually could make a difference, even at terrible personal cost. As they drove through Seattle, toward her new apartment, past the next core building that now stood empty with 4 lease signs in the windows, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not the naive hope of her younger self, the woman who believed systems would correct themselves, but a harder, more resilient hope born of understanding exactly how difficult change was and choosing to fight for it anyway. The sirens that had started that day 18 months ago brought police investigation.